Your Art Unlocked is produced by Art UK, the online home of the UK's national art collection. This podcast is supported by Bloomberg Connects, the free arts and culture platform that provides access to over 1,300 museums, galleries, and cultural spaces around the world. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
I think it's two little ceramic figurines. They look quite Victorian with all like the big skirts and the waistcoat. And they look like they're on top of a wedding cake to me. It makes me think of traditional marriage.
It looks to be a celebration of man and woman being together, hand in hand.
It's one of these things where it depends on a real taste thing, I would say. It's kind of, you look at it and go, what's that? I'm not going to have that in the house. Where if you were your grandparents, they would have loved it and they would have had a display.
A tiny art treasure awaits you at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. In a towering Victorian gallery packed full of works of Pre-Raphaelite masters, something small and decidedly queer is hiding in plain sight. Blink and you might miss it.
I really like the colours, the pinks. It's just pink on the woman, I've noticed. The colours are quite feminine.
This is a piece of art that I love. One which moves me deeply, inspires me, makes me chuckle, reflect on both the joy and pain of LGBTQ plus history. The work I'm talking about might be small, but it's certainly mighty. A ceramic piece called Happy Union by the artist Matt Smith.
Happy Union, it's obviously a married couple, I would say. Or they just happen to have been married a long time and are still happy. So they've had a union that kept them happy.
Here are two figures linked together, one wearing a dress and one wearing trousers, delicately sat in a display case in the middle of a room celebrating Victorian high art. That's from 1860 to 1900. What is this work doing here?
Really, really difficult to get the date on it. It could be contemporary. This could easily be 17th century. It's hard to tell the value of it. It looks dated.
I'm Jon Sleigh. My pronouns are he and him. And in this episode of Your Art Unlocked, a podcast that brings to life some of the more unexpected objects in museum collections, I'm going to unlock a cheeky work that tells an enticing story of togetherness and inclusion, and one which asks us to leave all of our preconceptions about art at the door.
What I particularly like about it is that they don't have any faces. So maybe you can envision yourself with your loved one being part of that art.
This is your art in your museums and galleries. So let's get to know it a little better. Now, we know this is a podcast, so before we get started properly, if you do want to have a look at this work for yourself as you listen, head to Art UK and search for Happy Union. So let's get back to the two figures, one wearing a dress and one wearing trousers, standing together, arms linked. Would you be surprised if I said that the two figures aren't in fact a man and a woman, but both are actually male presenting? Look closely and you'll spot they have the most gloriously indulgent mutton chop sideburns. But surely it must depict a man and a woman, given where you'll find it in the Walker Art Gallery. Would a Victorian-themed collection really include a display of openly queer people? The work reminds me of the kinds of decorative porcelain figures made popular in the 18th century. They are quintessentially pretty. They would be equally at home in a grand museum collection or on a working class mantelpiece, perhaps decorating a pub interior or a beloved charity shop find. But then alongside the work, you'll find a label which references the 2013 Marriage Equality Act in the UK, which legalised same-sex marriage. Happy Union was made in 2010 and is in fact a contemporary piece cloaked in the historically normative as a way to challenge that very premise. It draws attention to what is acceptable in museum spaces. Here's artist Matt Smith to tell us how this intriguing work came about.
Happy Union was made for a show at Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in 2010 called Queer in the Museum, which was a wholesale takeover of the museum to try and review it through a queer lens and to ask why museums were so hesitant to talk about queer people honestly and openly. Happy Union was about taking on the Rococo figurine collection in Birmingham's exhibitions. And they've got a really great ceramics collection. And as an artist who works with ceramics quite a lot, it seemed like a really good place to embed myself for some of the show. And I think ceramics in particular drew me in because I was interested in how I could make a mark that was not going to be erased.
Matt was born in Cambridgeshire in 1971, and apart from ceramics, he also works with photography and textiles. He's known for his interventions in museum collections as a way to challenge established narratives. For me, Happy Union really talks directly to LGBTQ plus communities and queer people about themselves. Here's Matt again.
I constantly go back to the importance, to me personally, of museums. And I'm conscious how excluding it can be to not see your own life or experiences included in the museum narrative. And growing up in the UK in the 80s and 90s, queer lives were not there. And that makes you feel that you're not part of society, that you're not okay, that you're not welcome. A lot of the work I do is about embedding people back into museums, and particularly embedding them in objects in museums. It's about producing objects that the museum cannot erase queerness from.
Matt's work prompted the museum to radically rethink its own collection from a queer perspective. Here's Charlotte Keenan, head of the Walker Art Gallery, to explain more.
When I first came to Matt's work, it was quite early in a research project, which was looking across the Walker's historic collections, looking to surface LGBTQ plus histories, experiences and stories. And often the frustration was that we knew these stories were there, but they were very hard to bring into the gallery and sometimes hard to talk about because of a lack of artworks and objects in the galleries which directly related to these histories and experiences. And where they did exist, they could sometimes feel quite oblique. So when I came across Matt's work, it really kind of revolutionized how I began to think about our historic collections and LGBTQ plus artists and history within the collection, because suddenly it felt really liberating not to have to root these histories and stories into artworks that were already here in Liverpool, but that actually we could respond to the gaps in the collection, to those silences in our history, and bring those narratives to the fore.
I'm immensely moved by Charlotte's use of the words gaps in the collection and those silences in our history. Belonging and unbelonging affects so many of us in different ways. So seeing this addressed in an art gallery is truly powerful. And how about placing Happy Union in the Victorian galleries? Well, that was no accident.
Happy Union has been on display at the Walker for a long time now, over 16 years, I think. And we always knew from the moment we acquired it that we wanted it to be displayed in the historic collections and specifically within our pre-Raphaelite and Victorian galleries. And that decision was partly because we wanted it to be a sort of visual prompt to our visitors to look at the collections and question the sort of normal heteronormative narratives associated with them and to question what they were seeing. And in some small way, we wanted the work to bring that queer visibility into those galleries that has been so hard to surface otherwise. There are so many artists in that room whose sexuality has been queried, questioned, debated for decades, and often since their own time. And yet in their own work, they were often obliged to hide themselves, to masquerade. They weren't always free to be their authentic selves. And so the work is positioned in the galleries in some ways as a tribute to all of those people, those artists, the models, the audiences that have looked upon all of those works.
You can find out more about the Walker Art Gallery and hundreds of other collections on Bloomberg Connects, the free arts and culture platform. Download the app today.
I love the feeling of queerness that Happy Union evokes. Intangible and sensory at the same time. Queer isn't just a thought, it's a feeling, it's an instinct, a spoken or unspoken understanding. What is it that draws me and others to this piece, and specifically to its otherness? Perhaps the answer in part is that it's visually camp. What do we mean by that? Camp is used in an LGBTQ plus context as a conscious aesthetic or sensibility characterised by exaggeration, theatricality, irony, humour, and a kind of performative artifice. It questions the idea of beauty and bad taste being in opposition and aims to subvert social norms and expectations. Perhaps you'd be surprised to hear that the notion of camp has permeated British art since at least the 18th century. Presumably, Matt was conscious of this aesthetic when making Happy Union. Let's hear from him again.
As soon as you get into ceramic figurines, you're never far away from the word camp. And they can be seen as diminutive and marginalized and irrelevant. But actually, I think for me, camp has this huge power of contradiction, that it merges binaries and it doesn't settle. And we see this with figurines. They're quite often merging high class and low class, whether it's depictions of high class individuals for working class mantelpieces or working class individuals for stately home dinner tables. And they're both irreverent and unimportant, but deeply serious as well. So there's this constant oscillation for me with figurines that I think ties really well with the idea of camp, that it takes itself both absolutely unseriously and hugely seriously at the same time.
For me, Smith's sculpture captures the essence of camp at its most successful. The work is cheeky, irreverent, self-aware. It asks the viewer to recognise queer people's democratic, emotional and financial value in museums. It creates space for the often erased queer life, but with a wry smile all the time. But if this work is about joy, it's also about pain. It speaks to a deep inequality. Generations of queer people in the UK have grown up with fewer legal rights than others, whether that be the right to marry or the age of consent. It's still not yet 60 years since partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales, and even less than that in Scotland and Northern Ireland. There is deep self-awareness in this artwork, which is, I should say, made by a queer artist, of the power dynamic inherent in queer communities having to justify themselves to the mainstream to find or hold space in museum settings. But an artwork entering a museum collection means that it becomes part of the establishment, a part of a shared history of all the people who engage with that collection.
I remember going around Birmingham Museum in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a portrait by Simeon Solomon of Bacchus. And without reading the label, it resonated with queerness. And it wasn't just that it was a portrait of a beautiful young man. There was something else going on. It radiated otherness. And the label about that picture drew me in and talked about Simeon Solomon's homosexuality and how he ended up dying in a workhouse. And I was just fascinated. At the time, I was delighted that there was a mention of queerness within the museum. And it was only when I came back to the museum with the Queer in the Museum project that I started questioning why the only mention of LGBT lives was linked to a kind of disastrous morality story. But that resonance of queerness that I think I certainly can feel at times, it's incredibly important. And I think not only is it important when you find it or feel it, you also become incredibly hyper aware of how the museum discusses it. And there are examples where very, very visibly queer objects have been heteronormalized by museums, or the queerness of the maker or the queerness of the artist or the queerness of the owner are actively scraped away from the narrative around the object. And that's, for me, an absolute double whammy of we will have your objects, we will have your experience, but we will erase it at the same time. So it's playing with that queerness is what excites me.
Queering an art collection or any cultural space means putting on show objects or artworks that challenge norms and go against the grain. How has this impacted the Walker's approach to its own collection? Here's Charlotte again.
We began by retrospectively researching the collection for LGBTQ+ histories, and certainly they were there. We always knew they were there. But more than just wanting to name, highlight those existing histories, we also thought it was important to queer the collection, and in doing that, to question the social, historical and curatorial norms associated with those collections and those histories. What else was there that we don't know about? What other experiences have there been? Histories have there been? And I suppose Matt's piece articulates a very specific sense of queerness in that it questions those established narratives that we so often, take for granted when we see couples, relationships, families in our historic collections, that they will be heteronormative, that there will be a man and a woman. And there's something about Matt's work that prompts a second look, and it queers your expectation of what you are going to see in the collection, that it purposefully mimics the sort of visual language of the 18th, 19th century, that it slips past you slightly. Have you seen what you think you saw? And I think that through that one act, through that one artwork, it inspires the visitor, the viewer, to take that same sense of questioning and apply it to all of the collections, historic at the Walker, and beyond too, I hope.
As Charlotte reminds us, the queer experience is diverse, encompassing multiple identities with different lived experiences and different ways of seeing the world. One of the most powerful things about this artwork for me is that it speaks to the multiple layers of the LGBTQ+ experience, and that's exciting to see on display. Happy Union has been on view to the public for 16 years, and so it's a consistent, meaningful part of the museum landscape in Liverpool. How does Matt feel about this piece now?
I look at the object now and I've got huge fondness for it. There's something very odd about an object that you've physically made that wasn't there. It was a lump of mud, and then you make something, and then you send it off into the world, and you don't know what it's going to do or how it's going to be received or what impact it's going to have. And it's gone off, and it's been in Birmingham Museum, and it's now in the Walker in Liverpool. And it's this tiny little figurine or double figurine in a huge case in a massive gallery of Pre-Raphaelite paintings. And I love that its tininess makes it speak so loudly, that it's out of scale and out of context.
Matt's right to draw attention to the work's size. In keeping with ceramic figures of this type made much earlier in history, it's only 30 centimetres in height, but it nevertheless packs a powerful punch.
When I made it, I would have probably wanted it to be bigger. I'd have probably wanted it to take up more space. But actually, what I wasn't sure about when I made it is now what I love about it, that its very tininess amplifies it. I think for a visitor going into that gallery, it makes you question why it's there on a scale that is so out of place with everything else. And I think it's those problematic differences that draw you in and start making you interrogate what the museum is doing and what the objects are doing in dialogue with each other.
We live in a different world to when this piece was first put on display 16 years ago. How has this conversation changed around the work, and how do viewers respond to it? Back to Charlotte, head of the Walker Art Gallery.
Maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the conversation around LGBTQ plus visibility within art galleries was really interesting to me, because so often it was framed through things like the Equalities Act and this expectation to give visibility and to serve all of our audiences and communities. But I think underpinning that was really a desire amongst curators to see themselves and to see their audiences represented in displays. When we started more overtly programming and changing our displays and our interpretation, we saw a huge response from audiences, specifically the LGBTQ plus community groups that we worked with. Museums and galleries, the arts, have always been queer spaces, but we've perhaps not always been able to talk about it in the terms that we can now. Often now the response is one of surprise when they come across the figure and they have this moment of kind of looking again. And yeah, you hear this shriek of, she's got a beard or something, or mutton chops. So I think there's now almost more of a sense of surprise around the work that warrants this second look. I think it's interestingly become a vehicle to then talk about that legal change in a different way, because especially for some of our younger audiences, same-sex marriage has always been available to them. And so it's now almost become a kind of prompt to talk about these now historical changes in our law system. The work's created so many magical moments after 16 years at the gallery, and of course will undoubtedly lead to many, many more. But what's always been clear is how much the work means to people.
Intrigued to access this piece for yourself? I don't blame you. It's one I've returned to for years and years now. In it, I find safety, inspiration, much needed reflection, a cheeky wink from the artist, and ultimately a reminder. A reminder that we, the LGBTQ+ community, matter. Our stories matter. And that change is possible. All in a tiny sculpture, and in the moment you notice the glorious mutton chops on the figures' faces. Thank you for joining me, Jon Sleigh, artist Matt Smith, and Charlotte Keenan from the Walker Art Gallery, as we looked a bit closer at this fascinating object and thought about queer art in museums. You can check out more episodes of Your Art Unlocked wherever you get your podcasts, and more episodes will be available very soon.
Your Art Unlocked is produced by Art UK, the online home of the UK's national art collection, supported by Bloomberg Connects. Explore more art at artuk.org.